I usually say that my story begins in many ways when I fell off of the roof of an underground house. This was back in the 1970s, and my brother and I had a construction company, and this was the first energy crisis. And so people were exploring all kinds of different ways to save energy in building and in cars and whatnot. So my brother and I thought that underground houses were the wave of the future. And one day we were building a home that was, they're made out of concrete, and I was up on top of the roof, and we had just poured the concrete roof. And I was pulling on a form board, and all of a sudden it gave way, and I found myself falling off of the roof. And I didn't even have any time to adjust to the fall. And I slammed into a pile of gravel, and I didn't know it at the time, but I ended up fracturing my hip. They took me to the hospital, and several hospitals in fact, and they did x-rays, and every time they moved me I would just about pass out from the pain. But in the x-rays they found out they didn't see anything, there was a problem, and so they put me in physical therapy. And I found out when I was in physical therapy that I was in extraordinary pain, and so the doctor came by one day and he looked at me and said, "You're really hurting, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, let's take some more x-rays of that hip." And so when they did, taking it at an oblique angle, they did find that there was a fracture there. So the doctor comes in and says I'm going to be off work for 6 weeks and that I'd be in traction. And so I went into this spiral of pain and anxiety at that time. Pain because the hip was pretty excruciating, but also anxiety because this was our busiest time of the year, and I was in business with my brother, and I knew that he wasn't competent enough to handle the business without me, of course. And so I just kind of went spiraling downward, and all of a sudden I popped through into an entirely different reality. And in this reality, all of the pain that I had in my hip completely disappeared. The anxiety evaporated. I found myself surrounded by complete peace. After a while, I was also standing in front of this being of light, and we were conversing about my life without words. And I came out of that experience so stunned because I had no idea that another reality like that even existed, much less the idea that you might be able to experience it. Well, I had been wrestling with an issue of whether or not I should go to seminary because I really felt a call to the ministry. And of course, my immediate reaction was, well, this is the voice of God, and I need to go to seminary. So I took my wife and, at that time, 2 children, and we went to Princeton Theological Seminary. And I went through the 3 years of training to get my master's degree there, and then became a Presbyterian pastor. But as the years went on, I began to realize that the real purpose of that experience was to give me a taste of something and to create a hunger for something that I knew that deep down in my bones that I had to understand and to explore more fully. That hunger was so intense, it was even more intensified as I went into the ministry because there weren't a lot of people who were speaking about that kind of thing, at least in my church. A few, but they were very few and far between. And so I found myself in this state of tension, if you will, between where I really wanted to go and what I really wanted to explore, and what I had to, the appearances that I had to keep up in my role as a pastor. And several years into the ministry, I ran across a book. I went into what was then called the world's largest bookstore in Toronto, Canada. And when you go into this place, there are books just as far as the eye can see. I mean, literally millions of books. I wasn't in there but 2 minutes when all of a sudden one book jumped off the shelf. And it was Bob Monroe's second book, Far Journeys. When I started reading that thing, I simply couldn't put the thing down. It was so stunning to me. Here, for the first time, was somebody who was talking in a contemporary sense about the experience I had when I fell off the roof. And when I got to the end of the book, I thought to myself, when I saw that there was an institute where you could learn about these things, I said, wouldn't it be amazing to go to a place like that? And then right after that, the second thought was, wouldn't it be amazing to work at a place like that? Knowing, of course, that neither one of them was ever going to happen. But 12 years after I read that book, I had my first opportunity to come to the Monroe Institute and go through the program here in the Gateway Voyage. And to my utter amazement, that world that I experienced when I fell off of the roof opened up in spades all over again, which was both gift and curse, because on the one hand it was a rediscovery of something that was so dear and so wonderful and powerful for me. On the other hand, it only increased the tension with my role as a pastor, because I was here sort of in a clandestine sense. I wasn't really telling anybody that I'd come to the Monroe Institute. And so it reinforced even more the fact that somehow, some way, I needed to be able to pursue this kind of work. And so I started to do it in a very small way. I actually started bringing some of the Monroe exercises into some programs that I did with members of my church, and with a very select group, as you could imagine. And to my surprise, it was, for them, it was like manna from heaven. You know, for the first time, they were beginning to get a taste of the experiential dimension that went far beyond words. And it was then that I really knew how significant this work was. I left the church in the pastorate in the year 2000. But 2 months after I walked out of the door of the church, I got a call from the Institute here asking me if I would like to become a residential trainer. And so from 2000 to 2007, I was a residential trainer here. And I had the privilege in that capacity of watching so many people go through this program and watching those new worlds open up for them as well. And it was an amazing experience to walk with people as they went through that process. In 2006, Lori Monroe, who was the president of the Monroe Institute, and also Bob Monroe's daughter, who had been in the capacity of the president since Bob Monroe's death, in December of 2006, she passed away. And her last wish was that the Monroe Institute become a truly board-driven organization. And so our board of directors became actively involved in what we do here. And one of their first tasks was to start to look for an executive director. And with the encouragement of a few people, I put my application in, and I've been in this capacity of the executive director since October of 2007.